Thanks for stopping by. Today, we're going to cut and fit and shape a bezel around a cabochon and talk about all the facets of putting a bezel around a cabochon. In part 2, which will come out in a couple of days, we'll cover soldering the bezel to the backplate, adding adornments like rope wires, things like that. And in part 3, we'll do a little patina and we'll set and lock the cab into place. Today, we're basically doing just the bezel around the cabochon for a good fit, good appearance. Before we get started, if you get something out of this, please like and subscribe, drop a comment. It really does help the channel grow. Click the bell to be alerted of new videos when they come out. Let's talk about different bezel styles. It's almost unlimited what you can buy out there. They can be had in silver, fine silver, copper, gold, whatever you need for the piece you are creating. Different thicknesses are available. The general rule is a smaller cab, go with a thinner bezel. It'll be easier to push over the top and set it. But if you've got a very large cabochon, you might want to go with a little thicker bezel material. Also, most bezel materials come in different heights, and we'll see why in just a little bit. First, let's talk about what we're actually trying to accomplish here. It's very simple, but there's just a couple of things to be aware of and a couple of things to plan for. Typically, when we're going to mount a cabochon, it's going to be flat-backed, so it sits into the bezel flush. And it will have a slight angle on the edge. Let's see if I can draw this here. Flat back. It's going to have a slight angle. Then it's going to round over to the top. So we're looking at this side, this edge. And this angle here is so when we set the bezel, we push it in over that edge and the cabochon cannot pop out. We can also, on some styles of bezels, round the top over the corner, and that will lock it in too. Typically this angle is 5 to 11 degrees. If you ask 5 people, you're going to get 10 answers. But if it is straight up, just choose a bezel style that has something to round over the top. Now, when we go over the top, when we set the cab into the bezel, we don't want the top to come over too far. The bezel will cover too much of the cab and it's just not going to look right. In general, what we try to do, if we have a cabochon here, I'll draw it again. Let's say the top of this side, is 9 millimeters high. The rule of thirds says get a bezel that is at least 1/3 of the height of the bezel. This is just a general rule. It doesn't have to be followed, and there's times when you'll have a certain bezel style or a cabochon style that you can't use the rule of thirds, but you don't want it any lower. If you have something that goes completely over the top, go ahead and round it off and ignore the rule of thirds. It's not always possible to use the rule of thirds, but it's a good starting point. Now let's talk about the height of the bezel. I mentioned that bezels come in different heights. If we have a cab that is lower than the bezel, there's a couple of things we can do. We don't want it to wrap over. We don't want the metal folding and looking crappy. What the Native Americans did, and a lot of the old-time silversmiths, they would put sawdust under the cab. It would help level the cab. It would raise it up. So now the cab is up here I'm not a fan of sawdust because it's a biodegradable material. It could leak, it could degrade into powder, and eventually the cab gets loose. The customer is not happy. If the cab is just too thin or has a very uneven bottom, you can do what's called backing, where we actually put a thick layer of epoxy or JB weld. Maybe I'll do a video on that someday. That will make the cab taller, fit the bezel better, so you can make a larger cabochon setting with a very thin cab by backing it. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, drop a comment and I'll further explain. The other thing we can do underneath the cab to raise it up to fit the bezel better is use some sort of plastic material. I have seen milk jugs, the plastic from a milk jug. If you need something thin, you can use an old credit card. Those are thicker, they're plastic. You could use 2 layers, you could use 3 layers if you had to. Maybe you have a very high bezel, but you don't want to wait to order a shorter bezel. Make it a little taller. Put your cab on top of your credit card, milk jug, anything flat plastic, draw around, cut out the plastic, and that will go into the bezel setting before the cabochon goes in there, effectively raising the cabochon. So, now we've got the basics of what cabochons versus bezels. Let's next talk about wrapping and cutting the actual bezel material. Okay, let's wrap a bezel here. I grabbed a handful to see what I might like, and I think I've decided for this set, necklace and earring set, I'm going to use a scalloped bezel. So we can eyeball this. It doesn't have to be perfect. I've got a scalloped bezel here, and I'm going to hold it up against the cab and kind of see how it looks from the side view. And you will see that this cab might be a little short for that bezel. It looks like it's going to roll over a little bit too much. I need something a little shorter. So let's put that away. We'll try a little shorter one. This is 1/8 inch. The first one was 3/16. All right, so we're going to take a shorter one. I'm going to look at it. Oh, that looks very nice. The stone versus the bezel. This is very hard to turn it where you can see. It will tilt over on the side angle, what we call the girdle angle, and it will do just a little bit of wrap on the scallops. I think that's going to work out really good. Okay. So, next step. I'm going to mark, or I'm going to start wrapping on one of the long sides. If you have a square or a teardrop or something with corners, never start your wrap or make your seam on a corner. It's just too tight. It won't follow the cabochon well when it's soldered. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to cut this bezel off right at one of the low points on the bezel, and I am trying to make that as perpendicular as possible. And I'm going to start on one of the long sides. Doesn't have to be any particular place. I'm going to go around the bezel. I'm going to make sure it's all tight up against the stone. And then I'm going to take my Sharpie and I'm going to mark where they come together. Now, something to be aware of, if you have a patterned bezel instead of a solid bezel, I'm going to try to hold this up again. For appearance, we really want the bezel to match the pattern when it comes together and gets soldered. If I can hold this, that might be a little too long. If I pull it really tight, it might be a little bit short. But let's keep in mind a slight gap, very slight, between the cabochon and the bezel is totally okay. You don't want it real loose because the bezel will start folding when we set it and it'll make corners. It just won't look right. If you do need to make it a little bit tight or you accidentally made it too tight, don't worry about it. A bezel, after it's soldered, can be stretched with a ring mandrel or a ring stretcher just like any other material or a ring band, and you can bring it out just a little bit and it should fit really nice. I am looking at this and it's looking like those two are going to match very well on the low point and just have a slight gap where I marked it. So now I'm going to cut again, trying to be as perpendicular as possible. Now we have a bezel that comes together nicely. I don't see any big gaps. Let's see if I can get this to focus. And after we're done cutting and we like the fit, you want to make sure you clean up the two edges a little bit. Again, making sure it's perpendicular. And has a good, clean, filed soldering surface. Now, another option. You can mark your cut a little bit long, even on both ends if you want. You can get yourself one of these miter boxes, and you can put it in and file the end of that perfectly perpendicular so that when we go to solder it, there's no gap. Let's see how that's sticking up a little bit. I could take a file and it would be absolutely perpendicular. Another thing you can do, just make it a little bit long and bring it down to the shape you want, or the size you want. Now, we have our bezel cut to fit. I'm going to look at it a few more times. I'm going to pinch all the sides, make sure there's no gaps, and that's looking very good. Next thing we're going to do is go solder this thing together. Before we do that, I'm going to put my optivisor on so I can see. And I'm going to bend both sides over a little bit so they match nicely. We're going to put this back on the cab, so don't worry about keeping the shape perfect at this point. And I'm going to keep bending it where the two surfaces absolutely match and are holding against each other. Now, if I hold it up, you can see how the scallops matched and it's all lined up. Maybe just give it a little more bend inwards so they're straight. See if it'll focus on that. And now we're ready to solder. Let's go to the soldering bench. Real quick before we go out to the soldering bench, something that I want to mention, how I solder my bezels and ring bands, anything like that. Option number one, we clip the bezel And I'm going to over exaggerate the seam here a little bit. Where the seam is on the bottom, put your clip up here somewhere. And this would be a side view like this, with the solder seam right there. One way I prefer to do it is I put a solder pallion right here. Remember, with solder, less is more. I'm over exaggerating the size of that pallion. I'm going to drip or brush some flux in the area, and I'm going to apply the heat from the outside on the bottom. Solder flows toward heat. I'm going to harp on that over and over. Of course, you do need to warm up the whole area, but as you're moving your torch, the solder will flow down into the seam and avoid a big blob down here that you have to file off. A lot of people like to put it this way in a clip with the seam up and put their pallet on the outside. You can do that. It's just going to leave a lump of solder that has to be cleaned off for nice appearance. If you put it down and put your solder pallion on the bottom, heat from the bottom, it flows through and you have much less cleanup to do. The other thing you can do is totally your choice, your preference. Try them both, see which one you like. Let's say you have a fiber soldering pad. Lay a solder pallion on the pad. Lay your seam on top of the solder pallion. Let's see if I can draw this, and I will again over exaggerate the seam. We don't want any gap. We want it together before we solder. So this is your bezel, solder pallion. This is your soldering pad. Drip some flux, brush, whatever, and then heat the area with most of the heat on the higher side. You can also avoid any damage to it by heating on the inside, upper side, but kind of move your torch all around, and that solder will flow up that seam again without leaving a large blob. Just another way of soldering that could be really helpful to you. So now we'll go to the soldering bench and make this happen. Okay, here we are on my grubby, grimy old soldering pad. I've got the seam, looks like right, here. And I'm going to find a nice spot that isn't too burned up. I'm going to use hard solder on this. And I'm going to grab a pallion with the tweezers, if I can. And I just dropped it. I'll grab another. And to give you an idea, that's about the size of pallion I'm going to use. I'm going to put that under the seam, set the bezel on the pallion where the seam is right over the pallion. For this, I prefer Mighty Flux or something similar in a little dripper bottle. You can get these for $1 on Amazon. And I'm literally going to drop a couple of drops of solder on the seam. Grab my little trusty mini torch. Get the flame adjusted here. For bezels, especially thin bezels, You don't need a super big flame. You'll melt the whole thing. Okay. I'm going to watch a little closer with my optivisor. I'm going to heat up the whole bezel so I don't lose heat. And then I'm going to start concentrating. That was it. It flowed. The bezel is soldered. I'm going to pickle this for a few minutes, and then we'll go back to the bench. Okay, all soldered up. Back to the bench. We have a nice solder joint. It flowed all the way through. If I can hold this up a little bit, there's just a little bit of a blob on the outside I want to clean up. The inside looks pretty good, but you can see it flowed all the way through. Shouldn't be any issue. So what we're going to do is take a flat file to the outside and we'll just smooth off that little lump. No problem. That's about gone. And if you have a larger lump on the inside, so it doesn't stick out, take yourself a rounded or half-round file and clean up the inside just a little bit. That was about it. Now we put it back on the cab, and what we're looking for here is any gaps or out of shape. If you get a little bit out of shape, that's okay. Leave it on the cab. Whoops. Take something with a flat edge, push a little bit up against the cab. We're going to go all the way around. Oop, there's a little bit. We'll just push it in. And it looks real good. Now what I typically do while I'm working on the black backplate and preparing that for soldering, again, that'll be video part 2 of bezels on cabochons. We will leave the bezel on the cab so it can kind of start learning its shape. What I also like to do, because cabochons are not perfect, they're always a little bit out of shape, I find the seam and I mark the bottom of the cab where the seam goes. This is very important because you don't want to shove a cabochon into a bezel that's out of shape, or a cabochon that's out of shape. It's not going to fit right. We've now made this fit the cab perfectly. I want to know where the seam is, so we'll mark the bottom of the cab for later. Looks good. This should work on just about any cabochon, any bezel. Get your height right. We've gone through all that. And watch for part 2 where we put this on a backplate. We'll add some rope adornments similar to this. And we'll get it a little bit further along. All right, with that, be well, be creative, and we'll see you in part 2.